Tonight's slideshow, 3 layers, the crisis and the solution. The crisis facing the United States has 3 layers. It is economic, geopolitical, and psychological/spiritual. And tonight we're going to be talking about how all 3 of these crises are related. They're all really the same crisis. One flows from another. They're all deeply interconnected. And we are going to present a solution to all 3 crises. And those solutions are also interconnected. So if you were wondering what's wrong with U.S. society, why our roads are crumbling, why we're having mass shootings and suicides and opioid addiction explosion, and why inflation is through the roof, and why it's impossible to buy housing that doesn't cost an arm and a leg, and all the problems we're facing, the major problems affecting U.S. society, the economic problems, the geopolitical and international problems, and the psychological and spiritual problems. They're all related, and we're going to talk about them all tonight, and we're going to offer a solution to all of them. And the solution is also related. So here we go. The economic problem facing the United States right now really gets down to a couple basic facts. Self-driving cars should be a great thing. Wouldn't it be great if the chore called driving was no longer necessary? If cars drove themselves and all the human labor power that was spent on driving and operating traffic courts and constructing stoplights and all of that was no longer necessary. It was pointed out by Andrew Yang, the fact that self-driving cars would lead to mass unemployment in the United States. There'd be millions of people with only a high school diploma out of work, millions of truck drivers, millions of Uber drivers, that self-driving cars would be an economic disaster. And the fact that self-driving cars is hanging over the U.S. economy as a curse, that points to a much bigger problem that we have. Because at this point, and this is what Jack Ma points out, is that everything that is done by human manual labor is very easily replaced by a machine. Machines can play chess better than humans can. Machines can trade stocks better than humans can. And that in reality, we should be living in a very, very wealthy, prosperous society because human technology and AI has advanced to the point that very little work is necessary on the part of human beings. And we're at the point that pretty much all human manual labor can be done by machines, and that should be a great thing. But we do not live in a rational society. We live in a society where profit is in command. And because of that, we deal with an age-old problem, a problem of poverty amid plenty, poverty created by abundance. This is an unnatural problem. In all the systems of the past, people were homeless because there was not enough housing. In all the systems of the past, people were hungry because there was a shortage of food. But in the system that we currently live under, people are homeless because there is too much housing. People are homeless and hungry because there is too much food. And this is not rational. And this problem of glut, G-L-U-T, glut, and poverty created by abundance is unique to our society. And it is exacerbated by technological advancement. Every time that the market crashes because of a glut, it crashes because there's too much wealth and abundance created. We have an economic crisis because so much wealth has been created, and it gets worse each time. And we are now in a moment where this problem of technology creating economic crisis, abundance creating poverty, poverty amid plenty, is more realistic than ever before. And I have a short clip that I've shown on these streams many times explaining this, and I will then go over it again after that. But we'll just watch. This is the clip where I explain the roots of the economic crisis that we're in, why the huge technological leaps that we're experiencing, which should be creating a great amount of prosperity and abundance, are creating poverty. We're going to just quickly have this clip created by Peter Coffin, explaining this problem, and then I'll just go over it again on this stream for you all. This is the basis of the economic crisis that we are in.
Explain what needs to be explained, what used to be considered Marxism 101, about why it is that our Western capitalist economy is crashing and burning. And in order to do that, I'm going to have to do some math. And I hate math. Do you know why I hate math? Because I grew up in America. I went to public school in the United States of America, so I am going to, at risk of embarrassing myself, because math was never my best subject, I'm going to do some mathematics here on the board for you to explain the problem.
We very much enjoyed Caleb's speech.
So if you are creating a product, right? If you're a factory owner, you're making a product, you are going to need the material through which that product is made, the manufacturing materials. So that'll be A.
The simple equation you put forward to explain the crisis of overproduction and the falling rate of profit.
And you're probably going to need to transport the product to where it's sold. That's B.
It broke down where your money goes.
You're also going to have to pay your labor costs. Labor costs are represented by C.
Explanations of those concepts that people are able to understand.
Then when consumers purchase the product, they're going to pay a final price. And that final price is D. However, there's a problem with that.
I like the fact that he framed it that way to make it very clear.
Which is that the capitalist can't change how much A costs. He can't change how much B costs. So the profit of the capitalist can only be extracted from the value put into it by the worker. And this is the basis of Marxism, the understanding of surplus value.
I've never seen it explained so simply anywhere. I've never been able to explain it that simply.
So C, the labor value, is divided. You have C1, which is what the worker actually gets paid. And then you have C2, which is the profit that the capitalist makes. And it all adds up to D, which is the final cost of the product. Now, the way people in the United States who talk about Marxism generally talk about this is they say, well, this is unfair. They say the worker is not getting paid the full value of his labor. But they're missing one of the most important points, which is not just that it's unfair and then people argue, well, what about the employer? He put up the money, doesn't he deserve to be? That's all a distraction. Because the important thing to understand is this. C1 is always going to be less than D. The wages paid out to the worker are never enough to buy back the product that he produces. There is always more products created than there are wages paid out to the worker. And this is the built-in problem of capitalism, the problem of overproduction. And it is always there in the capitalist economy. It never goes away. And they have invented all kinds of crazy mechanisms to try and deal with the problem of overproduction. Part of the reason that the US government has purchased billions and billions of dollars worth of cheese only to bury it in a cave in Springfield, Missouri, is to deal with this problem. It is an ongoing present problem, and it's a problem acknowledged by most capitalist economists. John Maynard Keynes said the problem was underconsumption rather than overproduction, but he was pointing to the same problem. The military-industrial complex in the United States is an effort to deal with this problem, to keep spending going. There's all kinds of mechanisms that they've invented to try and resolve this problem, but it gets worse. What is the capitalist always trying to do? He wants to maximize the amount of profit he makes. And one of the main ways they do that is with what's called labor-saving technology. Get rid of workers and replace workers with machines. As they eliminate workers from the process of production, as there's fewer and fewer workers involved, as machines take the place of workers, the role of C in production decreases. There's a little bit of a problem with that. As C goes down, C2 also goes down, right? As C decreases, C2 also decreases. And as the role of the worker in production is reduced, the rate of profit that the capitalist makes goes down. And this is called the tendency of the falling rate of profit. Only human labor creates value. And this is something that Adam Smith acknowledged. This is something some of the popes even acknowledge. Human labor creates all value. And so when you reduce the role of human labor in production, the amount of value created decreases, and the ability of the capitalist to extract surplus value also decreases. So this causes the capitalist to have to churn out even more products because he's making less and less of a profit on the overall product. He's making less and less of a percentage, so he has to churn them out. So this problem of the worker never being able to buy back what he produces and more products being created than are necessary, this problem becomes exacerbated. And this points to what is understood to be the deeply irrational nature of the capitalist system.
Right. So I'm going to quickly go over this again because this is so important. This is so important to understand, and it's important to understand on a number of levels. And I'm going to go over why it's so important. And we're going to come at this from many different angles, because if you want to understand why we have an economic crisis here in the wealthiest country in the world, why the good paying jobs are gone, why the living standard is decreasing, this is at the heart of it. And it shouldn't make any sense, but it does make sense if you understand this problem. So if you are creating a product, if you're making a tire, you're going to need, first of all, you're going to need the material that the tire is created from, and that is A. And then on top of that, you're going to need to ship the tire to wherever it's sold. So you're going to need B. On top of that, you're going to need human labor to assemble the tires. So that's C. And then the final cost of the tire is D. What's missing? Profit. How does the employer who put up the money get a return on his investment? Well, he can't change how much the shipping costs, and he can't change how much the rubber and the materials costs. He can only extract from the value put into the tire by the worker. And so it's really C1 and C2, right? That's really what it is. C2 is what the employer gets paid, gets as profit. C1 is what the worker actually gets paid, right? And this is as far as any of the internet Marxists go. The internet Marxists all just go, C, it's unfair. The worker is putting C into it, but he only gets paid C1, and that is unfair. And that is not the point, right? And then, of course, there's a response from the employer. They say, well, the employer put up the money. There wouldn't have been a job without the employer, blah, 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 blah. And this is the stupid argument that we constantly hear. This is where it stops. It stops here. That's not the point. The point isn't that this is unfair. Life is unfair, right? We all know that life is unfair. Some people have more than others. Some people are faster than others. That's not the point. The point is not that this is unfair. The point is this. C1, that's the wages paid out in the process of production, is always less than D. There are never enough wages paid out in the process of production to purchase the product. That's the problem. They're always producing more goods than they are paying out wages. There is no way that an employer can pay out the same amount of wages as he puts onto the market with products. So you always have more product than wages. The buying power of the employee is never enough to buy back the product that he produces. And this is called overproduction. And no, overproduction is not producing too much. And overproduction is not having too much stuff. And the reason we don't even call it overproduction anymore, because people assume they know what overproduction is. It's called the value crisis, right? Whereas the price of D suddenly starts sinking because people can't afford to buy it. And pretty soon it's no longer profitable for the employer to create D, and the market crashes. Economists generally refer to this with a four-letter word, G-L-U-T, glut. Glut. Capitalism has this constant problem of glut. There are always more products created, D, than there are wages paid out, C1. That is the first problem, okay? And that is a constant problem in the capitalist system, and it's always there. And there are all kinds of mechanisms that our government utilizes to try and deal with it. For example, if you go to Springfield, Missouri, there is a cave. And in that cave is billions of dollars worth of cheese that the American government has purchased from American farmers and buried. And the reason that exists is because they want to keep the American agricultural market and American agribusiness from collapsing. So they buy billions of dollars worth of cheese and bury it. The US government spends billions and billions and billions of dollars on weapons that are never going to be used, hopefully, right? Bombs and tanks and drones and army boots and all kinds of stuff. Why? Because when they buy it, that keeps the economy going. And Keynesianism, John Maynard Keynes, the economist, his understanding was that because of this problem, the government has to spend money. If not, you have something like the Great Depression. And I'll get into that in a second. But this is a constant problem. There is always more product produced than there are wages to purchase. That's the first problem. The next issue, though, is that this problem gets worse because of labor-saving technology. That's where I talked about self-driving cars and artificial intelligence. The employer always wants to produce as many products as he possibly can, and he wants to pay out as little as he possibly can in wages, right? The less wages he pays, the more products he produces, the more money he makes. So he's constantly trying to reduce the role of human labor in production with what's called labor-saving technology. If you can replace a job with a machine, then that's one less worker you have to hire. Then that means you can make more profit. Except there's a problem. And the problem is this: as C decreases, C2 also decreases. The amount of profit that the employer extracts from each item comes out of the labor power. The employer cannot extract profit from the rubber. He cannot extract profit from the shipping. He has to extract his profit from the labor power. So if the amount of human labor power that goes into production decreases, then the amount of profit that the employer makes also decreases. So when technology advances, the rate of profit that the employer makes on each item he produces constantly goes down. And that is why in the capitalist system, you constantly have gluts on the market, more product than is necessary, more product produced than can be purchased. But on top of that, you then have an even bigger problem, which is that great technological leaps are followed by great prolonged economic crises. And a great example of that is the Great Depression. Right before the Second World War, you had a great long-term economic crisis called the Great Depression. What caused it? Great technological leaps. What Henry Ford had done with the assembly line, what the great technological breakthroughs of the Roaring '20s filled the market up with products that could not be sold. And the market was glutted. And it took the Second World War and the mass destruction of productive forces in the Second World War to get us out of that economic crisis created by all the great industrial technological leaps that came during the 1920s. And it took a whole massive world war to reset the world economy from that economic advancement, from that technological advancement. Well, right now, we are living in the aftermath of a technological advancement that makes what Henry Ford did at the assembly line look minuscule. What they are doing now with self-driving cars, with artificial intelligence, is far more beyond that. The amount of labor-saving technology that we have now is more massive than ever before. And so it's leading to a bigger economic crisis than ever before. And this is the basis of our economic problem, is the employer cannot extract profits like he once did. There's less and less room at the assembly line for the worker than there ever was. The workers who are working are easier to replace than ever before. And we have a situation where jobs are being eliminated, jobs are being de-skilled, and machines can do almost anything. And if we had a rationally organized economy, that would be great. That would be a miracle. That would mean that we had a high-tech utopia at this point because there's so little work that needs to be done. But we don't have a rationally organized economy. We have an economy based on maximizing profits. And that is what has led us to the economic crisis facing Western countries, the United States most especially. That's why our economy is falling apart. That's why we're in the mess that we're in. However, the economic crisis gives birth to a geopolitical crisis. So, obviously, the United States economy doesn't exist in a vacuum. It doesn't exist all by itself. The US economy is part of a world economy. And in fact, the United States pretty well dominates the world economy, along with the British, along with the French and the Germans. The Western countries dominate the world economy. And it is bankers who have dominance over industrialists, and they dominate the world economy. This is called imperialism. And imperialism, the economic system of imperialism or globalism, emerged to address the very problem I just told you about, overproduction. This is what was said by Cecil Rhodes, the great imperialist, the colonizer of Africa. He said this in 1895. Quote, I was in the East End of London, a working class quarter, yesterday, and I attended a meeting of the unemployed. And I listened to their wild speeches that were just a cry for bread, bread. And on my way home, I pondered over the scene, and I became more than ever convinced of the importance of imperialism. My cherished idea is the solution for the social problem in order to save the 40 million inhabitants of the United Kingdom from a bloody civil war. We colonial statesmen must acquire new lands to settle the surplus population. That's all those people that don't have a place at the assembly line. Well, now they will move them to Africa. We'll move them to Central America. We'll move them to Asia. Next, to provide new markets for the goods produced. All those goods that can't be sold because of this problem of overproduction, we're going to sell them to the Africans, and we're going to sell them to the Central Americans and the Latin Americans, and we're going to sell them to the Asians, right? To acquire new markets for the goods produced in the factories and mines. The empire, as I have always said, is a bread and butter question. If you want to avoid a civil war, you must become imperialists. So the reason that we have a globalist economy, a globalist imperialist world market, is because of this very problem, is because the system is always producing more goods than it has the ability to purchase back, and great technological leaps are making this problem even bigger. And so an entire global apparatus has been set up to send people all over the world, to export goods and seize markets around the world and make them captive markets to consume our products. This is what imperialism is. Capitalism, with its built-in problem of overproduction, the tendency of the falling rate of profit value crisis, gave birth eventually to imperialism, globalism imperialism, which is a situation where the imperialists go around the world holding back development. And this, again, is what people miss. People think imperialism is bringing technology. We have this narrative that people have that it's like the movie Avatar. There are these beautiful, primitive people who don't have technology and live beautiful, primitive lives. But then the evil white man comes with his electricity and his tractors and cuts down their beautiful trees and their songs of, and that's not what imperialism is. Imperialism is the opposite. Imperialism is preventing countries from developing their own industries. When the British went to India, the people of India had been weaving and had looms they'd been weaving for thousands of years. Then the British went there and they burned down the textile looms of India, and they forced the people of India to import their cloth from the British looms. They dealt with the problem of overproduction in the British textile industry by seizing India as a captive market and by preventing India from importing its own cloth, by creating its own cloth, forcing them to buy the extra cloth that was produced by the British Empire. Another great example, right? What did Mahatma Gandhi, what did he get arrested for? What was his act of civil disobedience? He boiled salt water to make his own salt. He set a fire and he got some salt water on it and he boiled it to make his own salt. And they arrested him for it. Why? Because the British were selling salt to the people of India. And there was a law that the people in India couldn't make their own salt. They had to buy it from the British Empire. And so Gandhi was arrested for doing that. Another example, Mexico. They've been growing their own food in Mexico since long before Christopher Columbus ever showed up. But NAFTA, Bill Clinton's NAFTA, flooded the agricultural market of Mexico with cheap goods, put all the domestic farmers of Mexico out of business, and now the food in Mexico is sold by American agribusiness corporations. That's what imperialism is. It is holding back development. It is dumping excess commodities onto developing countries, preventing them from developing their own industries, preventing them from developing their own economy. Imperialism is holding back development, keeping countries around the world in poverty so that Wall Street and London can stay at the top of the world economy, despite having a highly irrational economic system where abundance and technological advancement leads to poverty. This is what imperialism is. The international problem that we're facing, it comes from the domestic problem. It comes from the economic problem. However, imperialism, keeping all these countries in poverty, using them as captive markets for the big monopolies in Western countries, that led to a blowback. And starting in 1917, you had the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia. And in Russia, you had this weird group of Marxists led by a guy named Lenin that were very different than all the other Marxists. And they said they weren't just fighting against regular capitalism, they were fighting against imperialism, capitalism in its monopoly stage. They supported nationalism. They had their own theory about how to build a political party, and they took power in Russia. And almost immediately after they took power, they had the Congress of the Peoples of the East in the city of Baku, Azerbaijan. And at the Congress of the Peoples of the East, the Bolsheviks and the Soviet Union said, we will support anybody who is fighting against imperialism. We don't care who you are. You can be a monarchist, you can be a fascist, you can be anybody. If you're fighting the imperialists, we support you. And they supported the Emir of Afghanistan, a conservative monarchist, because he was fighting against the British Empire. They supported the Egyptian merchants, who were conservative Muslims. Why? Because they were fighting the British Empire. They offered support to anybody who was fighting against imperialism. And the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917 gave birth to a global anti-colonial movement, including the Black liberation struggle in America. The Soviet Union made a big point of supporting Black people in America because it viewed Black people as an oppressed nation within U.S. borders. And they called for the independence of the Black Belt, the regions of the South that are largely African American. They called for their right to break away from the United States and become independent, an independent Black republic. And they supported the fight against Jim Crow segregation, the Scottsboro Nine, and other cases. So the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917 gave birth to a wave of anti-colonial, anti-imperialist movements. Countries in the so-called global South saying we don't want to be kept poor anymore. We don't want to be kept as captive markets, as underdeveloped corners of the world in the hands of the imperialists. Instead, we would like to break free and industrialize. And the Soviet Union did that, right? They became an industrial superpower. They built the world's largest steel mills. They built the world's biggest power plants. They industrialized the country very rapidly. Now, all of this led to the Second World War. And in the Second World War, the communists were on the winning side. The Soviet Union had been raising the alarm about the dangers of fascism. At the Seventh World Congress of the Communist International in 1935, the global communist movement decided they were going to focus on fighting against Germany and Italy and fascism. When the Second World War broke out, at first the Soviet Union, they had a temporary non-aggression pact with the Nazis, but the Nazis broke it. And then the Soviet Union kicked ass. And the Soviet Union, they were invaded. They had the Battle of Stalingrad. Millions of Soviet people gave their lives, 27 million people. And the Soviet Union marched through Eastern Europe and liberated the Eastern European people from the Nazi menace. In Yugoslavia and Albania, it was communists who defeated the Nazi invaders. In China, it was largely communists who drove out the Japanese invaders. On the Korean Peninsula, it was communists who were the main fighters against the Japanese occupiers. And as a result of the Second World War, the anti-colonial movement of the world that had started in 1917 surged forward because they took sides. There was a fight among the imperialists between the fascist imperialists and the democratic imperialists, the British, Americans, and French versus the Germans and the Italians. And the communists were with the British and the Americans and the French, and they kicked ass. And out of the Second World War, you got a huge chunk of the world that was under communist control, and as a result was industrializing and was building up its industries. And after the Second World War, the communists of China, who'd been key in fighting Japan, they were able to take power, and they became the government of China, the People's Republic. And shortly after the Second World War, you had the rise of African socialism. In many parts of the African continent, you had people like Patrice Lumumba, you had people like Kwame Nkrumah and Julius Nyerere and other leaders who were Africans. And they said, look, we want industry in Africa. We want our own power plants. We want our own steel mills. We want our own mining and our own industries. So we're going to align with the Soviet Union and China, and we're going to build it. And so African socialism spread. In addition to that, in the Middle East, you had the rise of Arab socialism. Abdul Nasser was the leader of Egypt, a leader of the Egyptian military, and he teamed up with the Soviet Union, and he built the Aswan Dam, the biggest power plant in the Middle East. He electrified Egypt, and he became an important leader. You had Baathism emerge in Iraq and in Syria. You had, movements of anti-imperialist movements that emerged. You eventually had the Islamic Revolution of Iran in 1979. Now, the Iranians are not Arabs, they are Persians, and the Persian nation of Iran was kept poor by imperialism, but as a result of the Islamic Revolution of Iran, Iran has very heavily industrialized. They are, at this point, in the 1980s, they had the construction jihad, where the Ayatollah mobilized the population to just go out and build hospitals and build power plants. They have universal telecommunications in the country. They've wiped out illiteracy in the country. They've done a lot of amazing things. Now, in Latin America, you had first the Cuban Revolution in 1959. You eventually had the Nicaraguan Revolution, the Venezuelan Revolution. You had the rise of socialism in Bolivia with Evo Morales. And all across Latin America, you have anti-colonial movements. Now, the Soviet Union fell, but after the fall of the Soviet Union, the fall of the Soviet Union was an economic disaster. There was mass unemployment. It was just an economic catastrophe. But then in 1999, Russian President Vladimir Putin got into office, and he began restructuring the Russian economy to once again be centered around state-controlled oil and gas. And he started using the oil and gas revenue to rebuild the industrial base of Russia, to rebuild their titanium industry, to rebuild the farming sector. And now Russia is once again a quite strong country, economically speaking. China is also at this point the second largest economy on earth. And so while the Western system is having a big crisis because of overproduction, because of the tendency of the falling rate of profits, you have a big chunk of the world that is no longer under their domination. Whether it's countries that come out of the African anti-colonial revolutions, whether it's in the Middle East with countries centered around Iran, Bolivarian countries, Russia, China, there's big chunks of the world that are not under the control of Western imperialism. And of course, their rate of profit is already dropping because of the technology and overproduction, all the economic crises I went into. On top of that, now their ability to dump their products and dominate the world economy is being challenged because there's a whole section of the world that is not under their domination, that they can't use to dump products, right? Why is it? Let me just throw this out there. Why is it that the United States hates China? Because they just hate communism so much? No. They hate China because today half the steel in the world is made in China. And so all the people that used to have to buy their steel from American corporations or German corporations or British corporations, now they can buy it from China. The US imperialists hate China because at this point, if you want to buy a cell phone, the best place you can buy it from is called Huawei Technologies. It's a state-controlled telecommunications company in China that makes cell phones that are way better than iPhones, way faster than iPhones, better battery life, better cameras, right? Huawei Technologies is a huge telecommunications manufacturer that is a competitor with the Western manufacturers. right? And why do they hate Russia? Because it used to be, after the fall of the Soviet Union, all the countries in the world had to buy their oil and gas from the United States or from countries aligned with the United States. Well, now that Russia is an energy superpower, people can buy their oil and gas from Russia. And the USA wants to drive Russia off the oil markets. That's why they blew up the Nord Stream pipeline. The Germans were saying that they would start buying natural gas from Russia. And so what happened? Joe Biden blew up the natural gas pipeline connecting Russia to Germany, the Nord Stream pipeline. They don't want competition. A big chunk of the world has slipped out of the dominance of Western corporations. So they're already having this problem of technology creating economic crisis, which is completely irrational, but it's built into their system. On top, in addition to that, big sections of the world that used to have to buy everything from them now are producing their own cell phones, their own oil, their own gas, their own natural gas, their own steel, and big sections of the world are not under their economic domination anymore. And so that is the geopolitical crisis. The African continent is asserting its independence. We have a leader in Burkina Faso, Ibrahim Traore, who's building up the agricultural sector of Burkina Faso and saying, we're going to produce our own food. We're not going to have to import our food from American companies. We're going to produce our own food in Burkina Faso. And he's providing education and he's providing healthcare services. And this great African leader, Ibrahim Traore, who models himself on many anti-colonial fighters from the continent, including the leader in the history of his own country, Thomas Sankara. There is a rising anti-colonial movement in Africa. All over the world, countries are no longer under their domination. So the international crisis, they're always telling us how mad they are at Russia, always telling us how mad they are at China, how mad they are at Iran, how mad they are at Venezuela. That's what it's about. These countries are not under their domination. The geopolitical crisis is rooted in the economic crisis. The struggle to control the world markets and maximize profits amid a system that is deeply irrational, where poverty is created by abundance, drives them to have to dominate the world market. And now big sections of the world market have broken out of their domination. And that is causing a huge problem for them. And that is the geopolitical crisis that we're in. However, it's also a psychological and spiritual crisis. All right. What is the ideology of the Western world? Well, in the Western world, we believe in liberalism, which is a philosophy that places individuals above all else. Now, we're not talking liberals as in liberals and conservatives, Republicans and Democrats. We're talking liberalism as the Western school of thought. The left in the Western countries emphasizes social liberalism, which is breaking people down into atomized individualism. Social liberalism says you have no loyalty to your family, you have no loyalty to your country, you can just be yourself, man. You can just do whatever you want. You are just an individual. You have no group identity. You don't even have a gender anymore, right? You're just you all by yourself. Liberals speak of all humanity and they speak of the individual, but they do not speak of groups. They do not speak of families. They do not speak of nations. They do not speak of classes. They do not speak of nationalities. They speak only of individualism, and they seek to atomize and break individuals down into total individualism. That is called social liberalism, and that is the left in the West that emphasizes that, whereas the right emphasizes what is called economic liberalism, which is you're on your own, buddy. Pull yourself up by your bootstraps. Nobody owes you nothing, right? The government has no obligation to maximize employment. The government has no obligation to improve living standards. Corporations shouldn't be regulated by the government. The state should simply step back and allow the economy to take care of itself. That's called economic liberalism. And it is the right wing that emphasizes economic liberalism. That's the Doge. The Doge is economic liberalism on steroids. What do we need a Department of Education for? What do we need the government hiring all these people and paying them wages for? What do we need that for, right? These are two forms of liberalism because they are opposed to any notion of collectivism. They believe that collectivism is inherently totalitarian and oppressive, and they believe individualism is sacred. And let's be clear, liberalism is not inherently bad. Liberalism played a very, very good role at one point in history. If it wasn't for liberalism, there would be no conception of freedom of speech. If it wasn't for liberalism, there would be no conception of freedom of religion. If there was no liberalism, there'd be no conception of freedom of the press or freedom of assembly, right? Liberalism was good because feudalism that came before liberalism and slavery that came before feudalism, these were very oppressive systems in which people didn't have any rights. And it wasn't until the 1400s or so in Europe that anyone started saying, hey, people should be free to pick their own religion. People should be free to say what they want. People should be free to protest. People should be free. We should have media that challenges the government. No one had ever said any of that before. Right? And liberalism, the rise of liberalism as the capitalist system emerged in Europe and feudalism was overturned, was a great advance. It was a great advance over what was there before. But why did it come? It came due to economics. No society in history had yet reached the economic stage of development to facilitate those rights. We're taught about rights, about individual rights in the West as if they are magical. They're just something that everyone should have at all times. And if a society doesn't have rights, it's because they're bad. And if a society does have rights, that's because they're good. And that's not true, right? In fact, go and read the U.S. Constitution, and you will read about how if Congress declares war, your right to free speech goes away. Your right to freedom of assembly goes away. Your right to freedom of the press goes away. If we're in a state of war, all the Bill of Rights goes on hold. Why? Because in a state of war, you can't have rights because you're at war. You have to lock down for military victory. You have to defeat the invader. You have to defeat the enemy, right? Well, if you look at it historically, you couldn't have had freedom of speech in feudal society because they did not have the level of economic development that existed. You couldn't have had freedom of religion in ancient Rome. You couldn't have had freedom of the press in ancient Greece. The reason people did not have those rights is because the level of economic development had not yet been reached. It's not that people were just evil until then. And the way they talk about freedom, the way liberal discourse generally talks about freedom, is it makes it sound like it's just completely abstract and magical. They don't understand that human society is constantly advancing. And as the economic system that we live under, it, changes in response to technological advancement, right? As new technology and new modes of production give rise to new economic and political systems, our rights change. There is a renegotiation of our rights. You have more rights in feudalism than you have under slavery. Serfs, right? They have their own tract of land. They have a little bit more rights than a slave has. Well, modern workers have far more rights than a serf has, right? And the idea is that with technological advancement and with the level of abundance in society advancing, we'll eventually get a society with total freedom, where there'll be so much wealth that's been created and so much abundance that people can just do what they feel like doing. That's the idea. We would like to see a society with so much wealth and so much abundance where there's enough to go around for everybody, where people exist and they do what they feel like doing, and there's enough for everybody. So there's no need to hoard or keep track of private property because there's just enough. We want to create a society of so much development and so much abundance that there's no need for an oppressive state. There's no need for coercion of any kind. So let's be real about that. Rights and the amount of freedom you have is intrinsically tied up with the economic base, right? And that if anyone tries to tell you that they could have had freedom of speech in the year 5000 BC, they're delusional, right? And the idea that we talk about rights and freedom in this abstract way is a real disservice because we're not understanding how society functions. But back to the main point. Human beings are collective in nature. As much as individual rights is a good thing, it's good that people are free to say what they believe. It's good that people are free to practice their own religion. We have freedom of the press, all of this is good. But we human beings, we are collective in nature. We're part of a group. The way you think of yourself is the way people around you react to you. Your notion of yourself came from your parents and the people you grew up around, and that human beings operate in coordination with other human beings. Everything that human beings do is collective. As much as you want to say I'm an individual, I'm a self-made man, I admire any hard work you've done in your life, and we all have our individual struggles, but you are a product of everyone else you've ever come into contact with. This pen was created by thousands of people. There is not one person in this world who can point to this pen and say, I made that all by myself. No, you didn't. The plastic for this pen was assembled in a factory. The ink for this pen, it was sold to me. This pen is the product of thousands and thousands of people coming together to make the machines, to get the plastic, to get the ink, to get this pen created. It's collective. This pen is collective. It is a collective effort. There's nothing that anyone can point to in our time and say, I made that all by myself. And you say, Caleb, what about a wood carver, right? Let's say there's a wood carver. And he goes and he finds the wood himself, and he cuts it up and he takes it to a wood carving show and he sells it. He can point to those wood carvings he made and he can say he did that all by himself. No. Because those tools that he's using, those metal tools that he's using to carve up the wood, he didn't make those all by himself. The steel was made in a factory and made in a steel mill, and the tools themselves were put together in a factory. And no. All human products, right, are the result of collective human labor. Human beings work together. We are collective in nature. Liberalism, which was a great advance because it created more individual rights, and we needed those individual rights, it has taken the logic of individualism to a ridiculous extreme. Liberalism is the notion that individualism is the highest value, individualism above all else, and a phobia of collectivism. And this is called philosophical irrationalism. That is the name of the philosophy that celebrates individualism above all else. Politically, it's called liberalism. Politically, economically, it's called liberalism. But philosophically, it's called irrationalism. Because philosophers have always debated, is the universe based on order or is it based on chaos? And those who believe the universe is defined by chaos are called irrationalists. And the irrationalist school of thought really exploded, particularly with the rise of imperialism, with Friedrich Nietzsche. And if you read Friedrich Nietzsche's writings, Friedrich Nietzsche is opposed to collectivism. He speaks of the Übermenschen, the great man, the great individual, who's oppressed by society, who is naturally superior. And he speaks of refusing to obey moral codes, refusing to think of other people, but instead asserting your dominance by creating your own reality with your willpower, by forcing your own ethical code onto the universe, and by ruling by your pure strength. When he wrote about the blonde beast, when he condemned Christianity as slave morality, he's celebrating radical individualism, the supremacy of some individuals, and he's calling for all restrictions on great individualism to be held back, right? That's the notion, right? The notion that human beings are only individual and that we should fear collectivism. This goes back to Friedrich Nietzsche. This is called philosophical irrationalism. And it's, you have the work of Ayn Rand, the philosopher who talks about objectivism and the great man of the motor of the world. It's just Nietzsche for business majors, Nietzsche for nerds. You have on top of that, you have the work of Leo Strauss, the father of neoconservatism, and his work, Persecution and the Art of Writing, the founding of neoconservative philosophy, right? Leo Strauss, Persecution and the Art of Writing. The idea that all the great philosophers of history have had to write in code because the masses of people, the idiot under the mob, the vulgar mob of people would persecute them, and that some people are just naturally better. They're philosopher kings in the Platonic sense, and that they should rule over other people, right? That is the notion, and that needs to be fought against, right? And that philosophical irrationalism very much opposes ideology. It hates ideology because ideology is an attempt to say that the world is defined by reason and that reason does define reality. And an ideology is an attempt to explain how the universe works. I'll explain, and I've used this analogy before. This is what ideology is. Ideology is if you're driving down the road, you're in your car, you know where you came from, you know where you're going, and you know how you're getting there. And that's called ideology, right? That's what ideology does for you. As you're going through life, you know who you are, you know the purpose you have, you know what you're trying to achieve. That's your ideology. And human societies have always invented ideologies, religions, philosophies, etc. And ideology is an essential part of human identity. In order to know who you are, in order to know why you're here, you need an ideology. Except Western society says ideology is totalitarian. Philosophical irrationalism says that any attempt to create a grand narrative of all society, this is postmodernism, is totalitarian. Any attempt to tell you who you are or where you came from or where you're going, that is authoritarianism. That is dictatorship. That is crushing your individualism. So the only good is what the postmodernist calls deconstruction, taking apart ideology. And so, of course, all kinds of people are being told there is no ideology, and any attempt to give you an ideology is wrong. Assert your own truth. With your greatness as a human, you can define reality for yourself. There is no rationality in the universe. The universe is defined by chaos, and with your willpower, you can just assert whatever is right and whatever is wrong and whatever is true and whatever is false with your willpower. That's what's being put out there. And this is the ultimate expression of liberalism. However, it has a problem because, as I said, human beings are collective creatures. And if you were driving down the road and you didn't know where you were going and you didn't know where you came from, you didn't know how you were getting there, you were driving down the road and suddenly you lost all memory of where you were going, where you came from, you would stop the car because people need to know where they came from. And people need to know where they're going. People need to know how they're getting there. They need ideology. Well, we've created a society that is at this point being stripped of ideology, that is saying there is no ideology, there is no truth, and is not giving people the mechanisms through which to define themselves. And so millions of people are stopping the car. They're stopping because they don't know where they're going. That's what you would do if you were driving down the road, didn't know where you were going, didn't know where you came from, didn't know how you were getting there. You would stop the car. Millions of people are stopping the car. And this is the psychological and spiritual crisis of the time that we are living in. This is what is causing the mass episodes of drug addiction. This is what is causing the mass suicide rate going through the roof. This is what is causing the mass shootings. This is what is causing all the confusion that we're seeing. This is what is causing all the pain oozing out of social media every day. People don't know who they are. They don't know who they are. They don't know what the purpose of their life is. And they need this. And they need it because they are part of a group, because human beings are naturally collective. And this notion that we should just be radical individuals, we should just be philosopher kings and decide it for ourselves, it doesn't work for most people. Might work for some people, might work for Leo Strauss, might work for, Kamala Harris, might work for some people, but it does not work for most people. People need ideology, and they need to be part of a group, and they need a sense of right and wrong. They need a sense of reality and falsehood, and they need a purpose and a mission in life. And Western society has abolished that. And that is the spiritual and psychological crisis of Western civilization, rooted in the geopolitical crisis and in the economic crisis. I just explained to you the economic crisis, which is then tied into the geopolitical crisis, which is then tied in to the spiritual and psychological crisis. Boom, boom, boom. Now we get to the solution. The solution to the economic crisis that we are in, this problem of the economic crisis and having a very prosperous society producing all kinds of wealth, yet poverty is rising, poverty amid plenty, poverty created by abundance. The solution is a government of action. We need a state that takes control of the major centers of economic power and manages the economy in order to ensure economic growth. We have a 4-point plan at the Center for Political Innovation of how to fix the economy. 1, we need to mobilize to build, hire the unemployed to build new roads, new highways, new bridges, kind of like what Roosevelt did during the Great Depression with the Works Progress Administration. Hire the unemployed in big numbers to build and construct new highways, new bridges, new schools, new universities, new hospitals, new power plants, new electrical facilities, new water treatment facilities, build, construct, new paved roads, etc. We need a high-tech upgrade. We need to hire the unemployed to rebuild America. 2, how are we going to pay for this? Public ownership of our natural resources, oil, gas, coal, and timber. These things that are just kind of in the ground in America should belong to all Americans. Right now, they belong to Wall Street bankers. They belong to the Carnegies and the DuPonts and the Rockefellers. They own it. They have a piece of paper that says they own it. They own our oil. They own our natural gas. They own our coal. They own our timber. Well, natural resources should be public property, and the wealth created from our natural resources should go into the public budget. Instead of you and I having to pay taxes, we should be getting rich off of our natural resources. It does not make sense. When we have a rich country full of oil and coal and timber, why in the world are you and I paying taxes just to pay for the dismal roads that are falling apart, just to pay for our shitty schools? This doesn't make any sense. The country's already rich. Why not use the wealth of the country to pay for building a prosperous society? Why should we be burdened with taxation when the very land that we are standing on is so wealthy already? Well, that's because that wealth doesn't belong to us. It's been privatized. Well, we say put public ownership over natural resources. Step number 3, banking. Every major religion, every holy book, the Quran, the Torah, the Bible, all of them forbid the lending of money at interest. Why? Because when money is created by lending money, when people make money by lending money, they're not producing any value. It is money created from money. No value is being created. That's called usury. That's called speculation. And the result is what Marx called fictitious capital. Wealth that comes from adding no real value. Right? A banker lends money to somebody, and then they pay back the loan, and they pay it back with interest, and then the banker has more money than he had. Nothing got created, right? That's money created from money. That's called fictitious capital. Wall Street is a giant gambling casino for the rich. All their derivative ripoff schemes and all their bets, and you look at Bitcoin and all of this stuff, no real value is being created. No one's getting a better life. No one's living standard is going up. Nothing is being produced, but people are getting wealthier. Money is being created fictitiously. It is called fictitious capital. The actual physical economy is not increasing, but the wealth of certain rich people, certain bankers is rising. That is something that every society in history has tried to prevent. And that's why lending money at interest is outlawed by the traditional religions of the world. Now, the way around this, obviously you need credit in our modern economy, is that we should create a national bank. Instead of having a bunch of private banks that get rich lending people money and a big gambling casino on Wall Street, we should have a national bank, a state bank controlled by us that lends money in the interests of society overall. That says, you know what, we really need more Americans to have homes. And so it starts lending people mortgages to build homes. We need more businesses creating, computers. So it starts lending people money to start computer businesses. We need the credit purse strings to be controlled by the nation so that credit can be assigned strategically based on the national interest. We need public control of credit. We need a national bank. And step 4 would then be an economic bill of rights. The right to housing, the right to education, the right to healthcare, the right to employment for all people, not as a handout. And this is something I've said many times. The problem with the way we talk about things like healthcare and education and guaranteed jobs and all of that is we're doing somebody a favor, right? We're giving them a handout, right? Well, it makes us feel bad that someone's hungry, so we give them free food. It makes us feel bad someone isn't getting healthcare, so we give them free healthcare. That's not how we should look at it. We should look at it as an investment. If you want to have a strong country, you're going to need the labor power of every person involved. So you should have full employment. Every person should be going out and working and producing and creating wealth for the country. So a guaranteed job, a job's guarantee is not a handout. It's utilizing the labor power of every person. If people aren't being employed by the private sector, hire them, have the government hire them to pave roads and build bridges, right? Have the state hire them to recreate a new university. I mean, there's all kinds of work that needs to be done to have a prosperous society. And the state should utilize the labor power of everyone. And the same goes for education. If you want to have a strong country, you need smart people. You need engineers, scientists. You need a well-educated public that'll make informed decisions and vote for the right people. So we don't want a stupid country. We want a smart country. That means providing education as an investment in the nation. What about healthcare, right? Well, if you're going to have a strong country, you're going to need a country where people are very healthy and can go out and produce and create vast amounts of wealth. And your emphasis is going to be on preventive care rather than treatment, because you don't want people to be sick and go to the hospital and run up medical bills. You want people to not be sick. And so your emphasis will be on preventive care, a preventive healthcare system, a health system, not a sick industry, but a health system that is constantly working to make the population more healthy, stronger, expand their productivity, expand their life expectancy so they can go out and build. We need to view human beings as the source of all wealth. It is human beings with our creativity, our brilliance, and our labor power, along with natural resources, that is the basis of all wealth in this world. So we need to maximize the potential and the wealth-producing capacity of human beings. An economic Bill of Rights is about investing in people. And with this 4-point plan, we would solve the economic problem in the United States. We hired the unemployed to build. If we established public ownership of our natural resources, if we put centralization in the control of the national bank and control of the credit and created a national bank, if we had an economic Bill of Rights, the economic problems of our society would be gone, right? Would be gone. We would not have the problems that we have. I mean, this would be a rationally planned economy where you have a government of action that is actively working to foment economic growth and construction, and we would solve the economic problem. So then that brings us to the geopolitical problem. What is the solution to the geopolitical problem? Well, the solution to the geopolitical problem is we need to get away from the dying Western imperialist system, away from NATO, and we need to attach ourselves to the new economy that emerged as a result of the anti-colonial and anti-imperialist revolutions. Building the peace bridge over the Bering Sea, right? The Bering Sea is a tiny strip of ocean between the United States and Russia. Alaska and the Russian Far East are quite close to each other. We need to connect the United States to Russia over the Bering Sea. And that would be a step, and it would pivot the United States away from the decaying Western imperialist economy and closer to the new world economy that's rising with the BRICS, with the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, with the Eurasian Economic Union of Russia. And that would be a great step forward. And this is going to be gradual. As the Western imperialist system declines, there's going to become more and more of the U.S. economy that realizes that to keep making profits, they need to be connected with the rising new economy in the East. And we need to be the champions of that section of U.S. society, loudly saying that the pivot to the East is something we support. That's where the future of America lies, not with the so-called collective West and NATO, but with the East. And that's what we need to go out of our way to say that we are advocates of. We need to call for building the peace bridge. In addition to that, we need to have infrastructure cooperation. We should hire China, that makes the fastest trains in the world, to start building trains throughout the United States. We should cooperate in the energy sector. Russia is very good at their oil and natural gas and their mining. We should have partnerships and etc. We should have scientific cooperation. Instead of having the struggle for fusion energy be a fight, be a challenge between America and China, China and America should team up for fusion energy. And this is all part of the process of investing in people and physical economy, not speculative ripoff schemes. Win-win cooperation. There you go. And when it comes to the psychological and spiritual battle, the main thing is people need to join an organization. where you have joint goals and a shared vision. It is very, very important that you join an organization. And it's important that such an organization um, enable you to work with other people, to cooperate with other people, etc. Now, eventually, these organizations, we're building an organization called the Center for Political Innovation, can provide services and community to people. And from there, begin pushing for a pro-humanity state that works to make people happier, healthier, and smarter. But ultimately, the solution to the spiritual and psychological question is we need to build a movement. We need to build a movement. Now, the way revolutions work, there are 3 stages, and it's actually interesting. There are 2 writers during the Cold War who explained how countries had revolutions. And one of them was Mao, the leader of the People's Republic of China, the founder. He led a revolution in China. And the other was Frank Kitson, the leader of the British military, who was the counterinsurgency expert. And they developed 3 stages of how revolutions take place in a country. And it was quite interesting because they gave them different names, but they were referring to roughly the same thing. And so I'm going to quickly go over the process through which countries have revolutions. At the beginning, you have what's called strategic defensive, or what Frank Kitson called subversion. And that's where we are right now. Frank Kitson, the British imperialist, would consider me to be a subversive. And what I'm doing right now would be considered subversion. I'm on here preaching against the system, the Western system. I'm on here saying we should have something different. That's considered subversion, right? Mao would call it strategic defensive, right? We don't have any territory. We're not doing any taking power, but we're going around talking about our ideas. We're explaining what we believe in. We're presenting. That's the strategic defensive, or what Frank Kitson would call subversion. However, out of subversion, you get what's called strategic equilibrium in Mao's terms, or what's called terrorism in Frank Kitson's terms. Now, I don't agree that it's terrorism. I mean, he defines terrorism very differently than I do. But basically, what this refers to is that conditions get to the point that those of us who are revolutionaries are able to function in society and have base areas of support among the population and to exercise power. Kitson would consider that to be terrorism because, you're exercising power. You're changing things in society. You're using your force to change things in society. When a labor union goes on strike and blocks the doors so other workers can't enter the factory, right? They're exercising power. Well, that's illegal. And Frank Kitson would call that terrorism. I don't think it's terrorism, but it's illegal. And they're exercising power. And now talks about strategic equilibrium. That's a moment. A moment comes in society where it's no longer just a matter of talking, but revolutionary organizations can flourish and can exercise power and can have base areas, etc., because that's where society is at. It's usually because the conditions in society have worsened to the point that people are ready to hear it. And it's also because the divisions among the ruling class have gotten to the point that there is a need for different factions of the ruling class to align with revolutionary movements, etc. So out of strategic defensive and subversion comes what Frank Kitson called terrorism, or what Mao called strategic equilibrium. And then out of strategic equilibrium or terrorism comes what's called strategic offensive, which is when the revolutionary forces are able to take power. The society is polarized around some big questions. The revolutionaries are on one side of the big question, and the old regime is on the other side. And because society is polarized, they are able to take control of society on the basis of being the dominant force on one side of the big question. Now, Frank Kitson calls it civil war. And the reason he calls it civil war is because ultimately what strategic offensive leads to is the existing state dividing. The actual government that exists divides into 2 sides, one of which is aligned with the revolutionary organization, the other of which is aligned with the old order. The state itself divides, and one faction becomes the new state, right? And that's, civil war or strategic offensive, right? And that's the process through which a new society comes into being. And again, words like terrorism and civil war are not helpful because we've seen this happen peacefully, relatively peacefully in Venezuela, for example. in Venezuela, they won the elections and they were able to, transition to a new state. A new state was created with a new constitution, with a new military that's trained in Cuba, etc. But it was done without civil war erupting in the country. There was a strategic offensive, and you had a situation where now in Venezuela you have a thoroughly anti-imperialist, pro-growth government that has emerged, right? So this process, this three-stage process of strategic, defensive, strategic equilibrium, and strategic offensive. This is generally how these things are done. First, you have a movement of people who work together and are just kind of spreading their ideas. Then the crisis intensifies to the point that they're aligned with some people in the existing government and they have a base among the population. And then from there, the crisis gets to the point that there is such a big divide in society, and they're the principal force on one side of that divide, that ultimately the existing state separates and they are able to assert themselves as the new state. All right. So what does that mean for us? What does that mean for us? First of all, it means we must oppose political violence. And so, somebody watching this is probably saying, wait a second, Caleb, you're just talking about civil war and terrorism, and now you're saying we must oppose political violence. Yes, because political violence is one of the main ways to prevent a movement from being created. And this happened in Italy with the years of lead, right? The years of lead in Italy took place. And those years of lead, they involved Italy, which you had a mass movement, the Italian Communist Party and the labor unions that wanted to leave NATO. And the way that mass movement that represented the majority of what the Italian people wanted was destroyed was by creating a culture of political violence with the Red Brigades and with the fascist groups, where people were afraid to get politically active because they might get shot and killed or blown up. And it got very confusing. People didn't know who was on what side, because some of the Red Brigades were working for the CIA, and the fascist groups were saying they were against NATO, but some of them were helping NATO. And it was very confusing. And by creating a situation where there's a lot of violence and a lot of crazy infighting among different forces, that leads to people staying out of politics. And the reason that right now mainstream media is in overdrive promoting political violence is because they know that political violence is a way to prevent the movement that we need. Right now, what we urgently need is people to come together and work together and begin building networks of people that are committed to a new society, that are committed to opposing imperialism and globalism, committed to opposing the low-wage police state. Political violence is one way to make sure that won't happen. The Luigi Mangione case, they are advertising for that case. They want him to be the poster child of what it means to be a good leftist. A good leftist is not somebody who joins a group and works with other people for a cause. No, a good leftist is somebody who goes out on their own and kills somebody. No, right? And we already have a situation where people are afraid to become politically active because there's so much internet shit talking. And there's so much rumor mongering. And there's so much accusations. You're a cop. No, you're a cop. You're a Fed. And that's bad. And it's very difficult to build a network of activists now because of all the internet confusion that is out there. But imagine if people were afraid to get shot. Imagine if people were afraid to get their legs blown off, like happened in Italy during the years of lead, or what happened, or get blown up or something like that. We wouldn't be able to organize. So the reason mainstream media is amping up and basically turning into an advertisement for political violence right now is they know that creating a culture of political violence is a way to crush dissent, is a way to push people out of building mass movements. I was part of the Rage Against the War Machine rally in Washington, D.C. We were sponsors of it as CPI. We had a reception afterwards for Scott Ritter. And that was a great rally. Why? Because there were leftists who went to it. There were right-wingers who went to it. And it was a big rally to oppose the escalation against Russia. And before that rally, there was a huge smear campaign. This rally is racist and sexist and white supremacist. I have never seen anything like it. And they did everything they could to manipulate the different speakers against each other and all kinds of stuff. They were really afraid of that rally. And I was part of the Medicare for All marches. And in the lead up to the Medicare for All marches, there was a huge amount of smearing. This is a white supremacist. Oh, my God. Oh, blah, 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 blah. And why? Because there were leftists there who were for Medicare for All. There were rightists there who were for Medicare for All. And they did everything they could to smear it. And during the lead up to during the opening of the pandemic, Jimmy Dore came forward and he said, hey, AOC says that she's for Medicare for All. and so does the rest of the squad. They should demand a vote in the Congress. They should force a vote. And oh my God, Jimmy Dore's evil, white supremacist. They demonize Jimmy Dore. However, Luigi Mangione just goes out and shoots a guy and kills somebody. And the response of the mainstream media and the mainstream left is awesome. Now, does that strike you as wrong on some level? It should, because Luigi Mangione going out there and killing a guy is not going to change anything. But the Medicare for All marches, if they had escalated, they'd gotten bigger and bigger and bigger, and they reflected public opinion that we should have Medicare for all, that would have changed things. Force the vote, actually having an up-down vote about Medicare for all in the halls of Congress, actually moving toward fighting for health care for Americans, that would have made a difference. And the Rage Against the War Machine rally, a huge demonstration against war with Russia of Americans who oppose the Pentagon and its war moves. That made a difference. And if that movement had continued and there'd been even bigger marches like that, it would have made a difference. And that's why they were all demonized and smeared. Whereas political violence, somebody just killing somebody, murdering somebody that they decided was a bad person, oh, that's amazing. Well, it's not amazing because it won't change anything. It won't change anything, and it will encourage other people to do the same thing. And the way they are celebrating Luigi Mangione, he's so sexy, he's so beautiful, the way they're advertising this act of murder, and now the way that they're promoting and celebrating a murder that happened at a track meet. You know, one student was in the wrong tent and somebody stabbed somebody else in the heart, and now they're celebrating that as, oh, self-defense. And I'm telling you, they are trying to foment a culture of political violence right now to prevent a mass movement from emerging. Political violence is something that sometimes mass movements turn to, but they turn to them when they have no other choice. When, I was talking to somebody on a stream the other day and they said, well, what about Vichy France? In Vichy France, you couldn't have a rally against the Nazis. In Vichy France, you couldn't speak against the Nazis. In Vichy France, all the Jews were being rounded up and put in camps. And yes, in Vichy France, there was armed struggle against the Nazis. And that was correct. But you know what? It wasn't Luigi Mangione. It was a network. They had something called the French Communist Party that was part of something even bigger called La Resistance. And there was a movement, a mass movement that had been a peaceful mass movement that existed, that had seats in parliament and labor unions they controlled. And when the Nazis invaded, they had to go underground and they had no choice. They couldn't organize peacefully in the context of World War II, but they didn't do it on their own in isolation. They had a network, they had an organization, and their ability to organize peacefully had been cut off. And so they were violent, but they didn't want to. They would have preferred to be peaceful, but they had no choice. And yes, that might happen. You might get to a situation where a mass movement exists and the system becomes so threatened by it that it starts cracking down and outlawing mass organizing, and people may have to defend their democratic rights, and that's a different situation. But lone wolf killing, some individual just going out and killing somebody else for political reasons, has nothing to do with that, right? Has nothing to do with that. A culture of assassinations, bombings, politically motivated murders has absolutely nothing to do with mass movements of the people that have gotten into situations where they have to defend themselves. It's like apples and oranges, right? It's like sugar. It's like fire and water. They are completely different things. And people say to me, well, Caleb, they've tried Medicare for all. It didn't work. No, they haven't tried Medicare for all marches. There was one day of action, and it was crushed by a mainstream left that is so controlled that they smeared it and they destroyed it. Well, Caleb, we tried Rage Against the War Machine. No, there were two rallies, one that was even smaller than the other, and it was smeared. No, we haven't tried. There's not a mass movement now. There is not a mass movement. There's a lot of people on the internet complaining. There's a lot of internet fandoms, but there is not a mass movement. We don't have a mass movement. We don't have a mass movement. So no, the idea, well, Caleb, we tried a mass movement. It didn't work. No, we don't have a mass movement, and we urgently need a mass movement, not a movement to tail the Democrats and protest around the latest hashtag cause, whatever is trendy, but a real movement demanding jobs for all, Medicare for all, and end the wars. That is what we need. And we haven't tried that. And that is what they are really scared of. And if a real mass movement emerged, they wouldn't know what to do. And that's why they have created so much internet smearing and so much of cancel culture and harassment. They are really scared of all of us, different ideologies, different perspectives coming together and demanding jobs, demanding healthcare, demanding an end to the wars. That's what they're afraid of. That's what they're terrified of. And so we've got to go do that. What we need to do right now, first, we need to do what we're doing right now on this stream and build up consciousness. Get these ideas everywhere. Right now, all over the Chicago area, thousands of copies of this book are being distributed with an advertisement for our conference. This is a whole book about Yemen and certain political organizations in Yemen and where they came from. And this is building up consciousness. Door hanger flyers are being put on doors, right? All kinds of outreach is being done to try and raise consciousness. Beyond that, we need to build up networks, people who can work together to raise consciousness, work together to put on events, work together to coordinate their activities. People in different parts of the country, people who know each other and trust each other and can rely on each other to carry out operations. In addition to that, we need to build up base areas. Once we have a network and once we have raised a lot of consciousness and we have networks to carry out operations, we need base areas. We need buildings, right? There needs to be a building in a certain area that sets up shop in a neighborhood and carries out activities in that neighborhood and starts organizing on a neighborhood level, right? You need to have a building. You need to have community programs. Today, people were talking about, well, Caleb, can we feed people? Well, at this point, I'll just throw this out there. There's a lot of different groups now that are doing different community service aid, and that's good. I'm not against that. But it's not building a revolutionary movement because they're not doing it themselves. They're going to, some church is doing community aid. They go to it. They take a picture of themselves at it. They put it on social media. That's not really changing anything. We need it to be the point that the revolutionary organization is providing aid to people. And that means we have to have a base. We have to have a building in a neighborhood that has enough people around it to gather and carry out operations out of that building and in that community. You have to do it yourself. And that it is not the correct approach to just go and do community volunteer work, take a picture of yourself and say, look, I'm a revolutionary. I'm doing this community aid work. That doesn't do anything. That doesn't do anything. And it's actually kind of cheap. It's just kind of cheap social media self-promotion. It's not helpful, right? Ultimately, it needs to be the revolutionary organization that is consistently carrying out the aid and has a base of operations in a certain area and becomes an organization that has a base of support in a geographic area. It becomes an organization that if somebody's running for Congress, they go and talk to the revolutionary organization because they have so much influence in the community. That's who they want to be in with, right? That ultimately we need to have areas in the country where anti-imperialist, anti-globalist forces are popular and are supported and have influence and feed people and provide services to people, right? Ultimately, we need to have base areas. And all of this is anticipating the crisis intensifying and strategic equilibrium. At some point in the near future, the game changes. The economy gets a lot worse. The divisions in the ruling class intensify. And at such a point, if you have consciousness built up, if you have networks of people who can carry out operations and work together, if you have base areas, and if you've built up relationships, you have political leaders who work with you, you have community leaders who work with you, you have churches and organizations that are friendly to you in the context of an intensifying crisis, where you have the consciousness, you have the networks, you have the base areas, you have relationships with different forces, then the revolutionary organization can really flourish in the context of strategic equilibrium. And that's very exciting. So right now, what is needed is not political violence, but rather the building up of consciousness, the building up of networks, the building up of base areas, the building of united front and relationships, all in anticipation of the coming crisis that will lead to strategic equilibrium. That is what is needed in our time. So I hope that presentation was interesting to everybody. That is my presentation about the crisis that we're in and solutions 3 layers.